Everything on the plane seemed just fine. Until, out of nowhere, a flight attendant suddenly confronted a passenger, demanding that he vacate his seat. Her voice was sharp, her tone filled with accusation. Within moments, phones were out, the atmosphere shifted, and what happened next? No one on board could have seen it coming. Before we dive into this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was a busy afternoon at the airport, with travelers weaving through the terminals, some hurrying to catch connecting flights, while others strolled past shops. Among the crowd, a man in a neatly tailored navy suit walked with purpose, wheeling a carry-on bag in one hand and gripping his ticket in the other. Unlike the rush around him, his demeanor remained calm and composed, his eyes locked onto the gate ahead. The boarding announcement echoed through the speakers, signaling the start of first-class boarding. Without hesitation, he stepped into line, handing his ticket to the gate agent with a polite nod. The agent scanned it, flashed a quick smile, and motioned for him to proceed toward the plane. As he strolled down the jet bridge, he adjusted his tie, briefly glanced at his phone to reply to a message, then slid it back into his pocket. Being among the first passengers to board, he made his way into the first-class cabin, where the faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Flight attendants were busy preparing for the incoming passengers. He placed his bag into the overhead compartment and sank into his window seat. The cushioned chair provided immediate comfort, and he leaned back, shutting his eyes for a brief moment. Compared to the airport's chaos, the cabin was peaceful, a welcome change. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a book and began reading, fully immersed as passengers gradually filled the plane. Just as he turned a page, "Excuse me, sir." The voice was sharp, firm. He looked up to find a flight attendant standing over him, arms crossed, expression cold. Her uniform was immaculate, and the badge on her chest gleamed under the cabin lights. Her tone carried unmistakable authority. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Raising a brow slightly, but unfazed, he handed over his ticket. She took it, her eyes scanning the details. As she read, her frown deepened. Without a word, she abruptly returned it, her voice now laced with tension. "This seat doesn't seem correct. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" His response was calm, steady. "Yes. This is my assigned seat." Her frown didn't fade. She shook her head slightly, as though convinced something was wrong. "I need to verify this in the system," she said curtly before spinning on her heel and heading toward the galley, leaving him to wait. Around him, other passengers exchanged glances, sensing a growing tension. The energy in the cabin had subtly shifted. Moments later, she returned, this time with an air of finality. Her strides were quick, deliberate, as if she had already made up her mind. "I've checked the system," she said, her voice clipped. "There's an error. I'm going to need you to move to the economy section." The man met her gaze, his face unreadable but firm. "There is no error," he replied. "This is my seat. You just checked my ticket." Her patience visibly wore thin. "Sir, I'm not asking. Gather your belongings and move to the back. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to involve security." A hush fell over the cabin. More passengers turned their heads, watching. A few reached for their phones, some already recording. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Remaining seated, he exhaled slowly. "I'm not moving. My ticket is valid, and this seat is mine. You've checked twice." The flight attendant's jaw tightened. Her voice rose slightly. "Sir, you're holding up the boarding process. This is not the time for arguments. Move. Now." More whispers, more shifting in seats. The scene had everyone's attention. Still calm, still composed, he replied, "I'm not going anywhere. You're free to call whoever you need to." Her expression darkened. Spinning on her heel, she stormed back toward the galley. Across the aisle, a passenger who had been recording quietly continued capturing the unfolding drama. The hum of low conversations filled the cabin. Whispers of speculation spread among first-class passengers. This was far from over. Minutes later, she returned, this time, a supervisor by her side. A slightly older man, he approached with a composed demeanor, a tablet in hand. His body language suggested he was here to resolve the matter, but the flight attendant beside him stood stiffly, her expression resolute. "Sir," the supervisor said evenly, "I understand there's been confusion over your seat. Let me verify your boarding pass again, if you don't mind." Without hesitation, the man handed it over. The supervisor studied the tablet, scrolling through the passenger list. His brows briefly furrowed, then he nodded. "Everything checks out. This is indeed your seat." The flight attendant visibly stiffened. "But I checked earlier," she started, her frustration bubbling up. "Are you sure there wasn't a mix-up?" Turning toward her, the supervisor's tone remained firm. "The ticket matches the manifest. This gentleman has every right to be here. There's no mistake." Still seated, the man spoke, his voice cool. "I've been saying that from the start. This is my assigned seat. I'm not moving." The supervisor nodded in acknowledgement before looking at the flight attendant. "Let's move on. We need to get the rest of the passengers seated. We're already delayed." Her face flushed, part embarrassment, part indignation. With a tight-lipped nod, she stepped back, casting the man a glance filled with resentment. Muttering something under her breath, she turned and stalked off toward the galley. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some exchanged knowing looks. The man? He simply returned to his book, unfazed. Across the aisle, the recording passenger continued tapping on their phone, sharing the footage with what was clearly a growing audience. For now, the issue seemed resolved. But an uneasy feeling lingered in the cabin. Because deep down, everyone knew this story wasn't over yet. As the man sat unbothered, flipping through the pages of his book, the flight attendant's stomach churned. Passengers were still settling in, but the tension hanging in the air was undeniable. The passenger who had been recording had lowered their phone, yet they were now engaged in hushed conversations with those nearby, likely sharing what they had just witnessed. The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, a quiet buzz adding to the uneasy atmosphere. In the midst of it all, the man remained composed, occasionally glancing out the window as if none of it concerned him. But those who paid close attention could see it, the quiet confidence in his posture, the way he carried himself with a dignity that refused to waver despite the discomfort forced upon him. His unshaken calm only made the flight attendant's earlier behavior stand out even more. Exhaling sharply, she reached for her phone again, dialing a different number, this time, to the airline's ground operations team. "This is Linda," she said, her voice low but clipped. "I need to log a report. There's a disruptive passenger in first class, and I may need assistance when we land." A brief pause followed before the voice on the other end responded. "Disruptive how?" Linda hesitated. She realized in that moment she had nothing concrete to say. "He's refusing to comply with instructions," she said finally, though even to her, the words felt hollow. "And he's encouraging other passengers to interfere." The voice on the other end remained steady. "Has he violated any airline rules?" Her mouth opened, ready with a response, but no words came. "Not directly. Linda, unless there's an actual safety concern or clear violation, it's best to de-escalate. You don't want this getting bigger than it already is." The line went silent for a moment before she ended the call without another word, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She wanted control of the situation, needed it, but it was slipping further and further from her grasp. Meanwhile, back in the first-class cabin, another shift was unfolding. The man's quiet defiance had not gone unnoticed. Some passengers had begun to see him differently, not as a problem, but as someone standing his ground against unfairness. A woman seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward him, her voice just above a whisper. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. It's unbelievable." He met her gaze, giving a small nod, his response calm but unwavering. "Thank you. It'll work out." From her place in the galley, the flight attendant watched the exchange, her jaw tightening, her fists clenched at her sides. To her, this was no longer just about enforcing the rules. Now it felt personal,